We're going to get started. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, who's also a sponsor for this conference. I met Dr. Williams the first time in Portland, Oregon. She conducted a training at our agency, and I knew in Dr. Williams I found a kindred spirit. We connected right away, talking about all things travel training. When I learned that she was also based in San Diego, even I could connect the dots and think, oh my gosh, maybe we should have her come to a keynote for us. So Dr. Williams is a visiting scholar at the University of San Diego School of Leadership and Education Sciences. Her research focuses on leadership, better inclusion practices, and discovering paths to equity for disabled students and adults. She's also a licensed clinical psychologist who combines lived experience and disability activism with a social vision to found the Invisible Disability Project. And so without further delay, Dr. Linda Williams.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. I will use this mic and then I'll use this mic for other things. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. I'm always really excited when people come to San Diego, and I can hear in Bill Sprawl's description that he is excited too. I hope you guys are all having a nice time. And I'll just get this plug in. If you'd like to hike, please go to Torrey Pines State Beach. They have the most amazing soaring cliffs and gorgeous crystal clear water. And it was about 78 degrees last week. So a little bit of tropical right here. And also, I heard you're going to the microbrewery, so I mean, that goes without saying. So I hope you have a good time. Okay. Thank you, Mike Mullins, for inviting me. He's right. When I met him, I definitely felt a kindred spirit, and he introduced me to basically the field of travel instruction. In my work, I've known that travel trainers play an important role, especially in rehabilitation, but I was not aware that this is an incredible body of people and growing, and about a 20-year-old industry. So it's exciting to see that. I want to start today and have this talk in two different parts. You guys will see that in front of you is a handout. The first page is just a brief description of what we'll talk about today, our goals and our objectives. But also, if you flip the page, there's a glossary. And I may be using words that are unfamiliar, but they're really important, impactful, powerful words. And I think not just for today, but I wanted to give you this because moving forward in your daily work as you interact with people every day to enhance their life, to open their ability to access transportation so that they can access the important personal, social, and professional aspects of their life, these words will be powerful for you to know and to use. So I hope you enjoy that. Okay. Mike gave me a very nice introduction, but those are just roles that I occupy in my life. Yes, I am a visiting scholar and work on research. And yes, I am in the role of a clinical psychologist. And I'm also in the role of a founder of a disability organization. But the role that brings me here today to talk to you is the role of a disabled person. I have an autoimmune disease. And my autoimmune disease impacts my retina. So I'm losing my vision. And while to the outside observer, you may not be able to see that I have a disability, I know very clearly every day when I wake up and straight lines look wavy or colors look gray, and brown, that I have a disease and a disability. And it really comes into play when my disability bumps up against the social world. And what I mean by that is when I get a call from my friend saying, hey, let's go out to Joshua Tree for the weekend. We're going to drive at night. Are you cool with that? And I think, no, I can't drive at night anymore. I see bright lights and they sort of turn into fractals against the cells in my eyes, and I just can't see. Or when I go out to dinner and I look at that little tiny menu and rather than asking the person I'm with or the people I'm with, can you read the menu for me? I normally end up eating things that I don't like because I end up having what she's having or what he's having. And another way that I feel the disability is just in everyday living, like going to the movies and not being able to read captions or not being able to play racket sports anymore. It seems trivial, but it leaves me feeling inadequate, sad, isolated, and alone. And yet, outside, I know I don't appear disabled. And that's because I have an invisible disability. I never would have considered myself a disabled person, and I wouldn't have used even those terms. I might have said person with a disability, or I'm a clinical psychologist and scholar with a disability. But it was when I had a child, a beautiful, wise child who's also on the autism spectrum. And when I walked through his disability journey with him, I realized that the word disabled very accurately described my lived experience and most aptly described his lived experience. And I want to share a little bit about that. And I want to just parenthetically let you know that for the longest time, I did not speak about my son's experience because I think it's important that we let people with disabilities or disabled people have their voice. But he's older now, and he wants me to share his story. So I want to let you know that I'm sharing this with his blessing and permission. Another role that I occupy is that I'm a proud single parent by choice. So that means that when my son goes to school and something goes wrong, I'm the person they call to fix it. And when he was in second grade, I got a phone call from his school principal, and I canceled all my patients and I went down to the school, and all he said was, you must come immediately and pick up your child. I thought, okay, he's safe. Yes, he's safe. Okay, all right, I'm not going to worry about that. And I went there. But when I arrived, I saw my son in the corner with a beet red face and tears streaming down his face. And I just saw this tall, stern-looking principal and this blank table with a piece of paper on it. And he takes his fingers and he just sort of pushes that paper in front of me. And I look down and I see all kinds of legalese and boilerplate language. But what was really obvious was the box that was checked with my son's little chicken scratch second grade signature. And it said, I willfully caused violence toward an adult staff member. And I thought, okay, what happened? This is new. What is this? What happened? There was no qualitative information. And it turned out, when I actually got the data, it turned out that my son, who, by the way, is part of a protected class, because he's disabled, he qualifies for what's called an individual education plan, or an IEP. And that means that he is afforded the right to have therapies during his education time. So he was in a turn-taking exercise with the school psychologist, right? Because learning how to take turns is pretty important. So the psychologist had a die, and they would, shake it and take turns and move a little bear around a board. And it was her turn. And she said, "It's my turn." And he was still holding on to the die because, he was there to learn how to take turns. She grabbed it from his hand and pried his hand open. And he pulled back and slapped the top of her hand and said, "No, my die." And for her, that satisfied the criteria for violence. And she took him to the principal's office, and that's what happened that day. But the part that was most astounding to me was that the punishment was suspension. Suspended, 2nd grade, for manifesting his disability within a therapy session. I didn't know what to do at that point other than take my child home and make sure he had a pretty decent day. I think we went to Krispy Kreme or something. But about a month later, the same kind of phone call came in. And the same routine, canceled my patients, drove over to the school, and it was the same tableau. A crying kid, a stern, towering principal, and that same legalese boilerplate paper with boxes and no qualitative information. This time, however, a new box was checked. It said, "Destruction of school property." Now, I don't know about you, but when I imagine destroyed school property, I get into the fantasy of chairs thrown through windows and fires in garbage cans in the bathroom and maybe graffiti sprayed all over the wall. But there was no such qualitative information. So when I asked, he said, the principal, he crumpled his homework and he broke his pencil. I mean, I can just hear from your gasps and giggles. So I didn't exactly have that reaction at that time. But I kind of went silent and I said, okay, and you know that he's autistic, you know he's part of a protected class, and you know he has an IEP, right? Yes, but we have what's called a zero tolerance policy. And that means that this is his second infraction, and so the consequences are 3 days suspension. So I said, okay, fine. My son, bewildered, none the wiser, goes home. We go home. But at that point, my head kind of snapped off and started orbiting a place I've never been. And I thought, if this is happening to my kid, who is autistic and does not look disabled, and we live in a wealthy school district with a bunch of white people, what's happening all across our country right now for parents that may not have education or who can't leave their job, or for kids of color who get checked boxes and a cumulative record with no qualitative information. This is dangerous and often deadly for these kids. I just couldn't stop thinking about this. And I called civil rights attorneys, I called special education attorneys. They said, can you believe that they're doing this to my kid? And they said, yes, but you have a pretty good case. It'll probably cost you about $100,000, and you may or you may not prevail. But I was thinking, gosh, I'm going to be that mom, right? That mom who's just fighting the school, and will be known as that family. And I will be muscling for rank in a system that will always be unyielding. And at that time, I just took a deep breath. And instead of engaging with litigation, I decided to engage in a social movement. I quit my job and I started the Invisible Disability Project. We are a 501c3, and we are changing the social narrative around what it means to be disabled in our society, to have agency and voice in a system and structures that do not accommodate diverse bodies and diverse minds. And probably as travel instructors and people who are committed to enhancing the lives of every person that you interact with every day in your job, you understand the many oppressive forces that people with disabilities face every single day. Invisible Disability Project wants to take that on. I started with engaging scholars. I started with what I knew. I went to a lexicographer and I said, this word, invisible disability, I want you to tell me the entire history, the lineage of this word. What's the first time we used it as a culture? Turns out it hit the books in the 30s, 1930s. And it had peaks and valleys. And of course, as we moved into civil rights movements in the 80s and 90s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, we started to see the word invisible disability climb. But then I engaged activists, and I wanted to learn everything I could about the activist movements. And I participated with the activist voice. And I realized, okay, a lot has been done, but there's a lot that needs to be done. And I found myself in a pretty unique position in that I myself had the lived experience of a disability, my child did, but I also am a professional kind of in the world that makes policies and enacts research and theories. And so I also have a voice to change on that end too. It made sense. So today, this is about 3 years later, amazingly, we have about 134,000 members of our community. And we are growing. We have a storytelling platform called This Is Me, where people can exclaim their identity and claim their voice and space in a video story. We have a support group, an online support group that we're wanting to get off the ground, working on it. We found that many people with invisible disabilities lack support. But that's how I got here today and why I know Mike, because I performed a 180 in my life. I used this experience with my son and my own experience with disability to say, well, wait a minute. I am disabled. And if I can't say the word disabled, how can I expect anyone else to? How can I expect lawmakers to, policymakers? I need to do so with pride. And today, my son and I both are proudly disabled. Now, I want to say parenthetically here, and I had a conversation with Mike about it, there's a lot of discussion out there about the difference between person-first language and disability-first language. And I want to say here that both are perfectly okay to use. You will find many people with disabilities who don't claim that as an identity and who want to distance themselves some or see themselves as whole humans beyond their disability using person-first language. And it's important when you're interacting with people every day to listen to the way a person identifies themselves to you. So that's why, toggling between the two forms is really important. Now, where I come from and in the world of activism, we absolutely use disability first language. We have a hashtag that says hashtag say the word, which was coined by Lawrence Carter Long. And we say the word because we want to reclaim what's once considered ugly or marginalized. And it's important for that reason. So I just wanted to bring that up. Okay. I want to get to the presentation. This was just an introduction. But today we're going to be talking about invisible disabilities. And it's kind of an alluring title, What About Becky? The Disappearing of Disabled Bodies in American Society. And I don't know if you all can see on the table, but Share a Smile Becky is there. And she's with her friend, Barbie and Ken in their PG. Well, we'll get to that. Okay. I didn't click right. I should have. This should have been up the whole time I was telling my story. But there's my incredible son. And that's our story. And that's our journey. I didn't click right, but here we are. I'm clicking right now. Let me get my notes. So because of my visual impairment, I do need to read some notes because this is very difficult for me to read, but you guys can read this. Unless there's a reader who wants to read the slide. Does anyone want to volunteer? No volunteers. I'll read. Okay. All right. So my accommodations is that I use 20-point font. Pretty cool, right? All right. So the overview of the talk. Today we want to define invisible disabilities. Now this is important. I choose to do it this way because really by deconstructing the word, you remember I'm kind of a word nerd, so don't nod off. Trust me, we're going somewhere with this. We're going to define invisible in two different ways, and this will really help us deeply understand the complexity of what it means to be invisible in our society. I also want to situate invisible disabilities within the two models of disability, the social model and the medical model. How many of you, show of hands, have heard of either one? Okay, so pretty much almost everybody. That's great. And then later on, I want to trace some notable moments in disability history that really have shaped the contemporary notion of where we are in disability. I'm not going to use that word, but just what it means to be disabled. Okay. The objective is, obviously, I want you to gain a deeper understanding and connection to what it means to have an invisible disability and also for the people that you work with every day. To build solidarity with the disability community and to work toward greater personal agency and civil rights as whole humans, which is very important, whole humans. And also to feel personal agency yourself and the freedom to speak and claim your own identity, disabled or otherwise. Okay. See, Mike, I'm getting it. Click right. Okay. So this slide says,
reframing invisible 2 ways.
Thank you. All right, so let's do that. I find that the word invisible is both an adjective and a noun. This is not grammar school. But the reason we need to make this distinction clear is that invisible describes a disability, right? It can be something that is unseen. The body is unmarked. There are no assistive devices. It's an invisible disability. But invisible in our social work that we do every day as we interact with people, invisible is a state of being. Who here understands that in your practice with your clients every day? A couple people. Invisible is a state of being. Okay. So that's blank, and I know that that's blank. Here are some invisible disabilities. So we see things like autism, ADHD, cognitive impairments, Crohn's disease, diabetes. Who here either has personal experience with this or knows someone that has personal experience with an invisible disability? Right, pretty much everybody. And do you have clients that have invisible disabilities? Yes. Okay. So it's important. So, sorry, this setup is a little bit, okay, yeah, good. The medical model. So let's situate invisible disabilities as we know them now within the medical model. And the medical model really describes disability as a pathology in the body that happens to the individual. And it's something that people in the medical profession look to treat, to intervene in some way, or to cure. And the late Tobin Siebers, who wrote on disability theory in 2008, said it this way, that disability is really just part of the individual. And that's an important distinction when we look at disability as it relates to the social world, which we will get to. Okay, so what I'm about to play for you, and Mike's had the benefit of seeing this, are stories, individual stories of people with invisible disabilities. And from their perspective, what it's like to live with an invisible disability. And let's pray that the audio works. No audio. Well, it's okay, it's captioned. There we go. This is also an example where having accessible captions really benefits everybody.
I don't want to setting it up.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So, where's your?
Uh-oh.
I just don't know which are
Okay. Teamwork. Life hack.
Never forgetting that the brain is a very important part of a disability, of any disability. My name is Laura. I live with an acquired brain injury, PTSD, and anxiety. I have lupus, and this is me. To me, what's abnormal is trying to do something you're not.
That's okay. We can skip this. I'll describe it. All right, my apologies. Software glitch. It's a technical problem. It's okay. That's okay. I can describe it. Let me describe it for you. I had 4 people that volunteered and really wanted to tell their story about what it meant to them to have an invisible disability. The first person, Laura, had a brain injury, PTSD, and lupus. She had had a car accident that caused her brain injury. And she realized that, everything changed for her, obviously. But the biggest change she felt was that she still looked normal, quote unquote. And that's kind of the problem, is that this whole notion of normal is kind of a fantasy. The notion of normal bodies and normal minds. And then the next person that we had was Noah, and Noah had Crohn's disease. And he was just talking about how he looks normal, but he's actually bleeding inside at this moment. And people can't see that, and they can't connect that when he leaves class early or he's having a bad day, it's not because of the implicit biases most people carry with them, that he's lazy and not an achiever. It's that he's bleeding inside. His body's dehydrated. He's sick. He needs to go home. That's what Noah talked about. And there's another guy who has something called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And I really liked what he said. He said, it's not that I'm upset that I have this invisible disability. It's that my body's not what I expected it to be. So for him, he's kind of grieving the loss of his non-disabled body. And the last story, which I found to be most impactful, and I know we're not supposed to choose favorites, but he really was one of my favorites. It was Terrell. And Terrell had lupus, and he said that he did not want to be put in the invisibility box in his life because of his lupus. And so he worked really hard. And sometimes folks with disabilities tend to work even harder, a lot of personal labor to not be that stereotypical person and have those biases like lazy. He never wanted to take any kind of, welfare and worked very hard. And he just, anyway, his story was really compelling for me. So all of them told This Is Me stories. If you are at all interested, they are all on the IDP website. These are incredible people. Okay, so from what I can see, this is now the social model, right?
Yeah.
All right. So what we're talking about here and what their stories exemplify is that really this whole thing of thinking about disability as the medical model, an artifact within just an individual, is extremely restricted of a model to use when looking at disability. We really need to consider the social barriers a person encounters. And it's not just the structures and the systems, it's the everyday prejudices that we experience. It's the biases around diverse bodies and diverse minds. And of course, my story falls right into that, and so does my son's story. And probably, like you raised your hand, you guys know folks who are impacted socially as well. So the conclusion that I come to, and I don't know if you all in this room are taking this in, but disability is a cultural phenomenon. And as travel instructors, can some of you just speak out, maybe 2 or 3 of you, where you see invisibility? Anyone?
Well, I'm a teacher, District 75, New York City Department of Education. We travel train students with cognitive disabilities. And first of all, they're entitled to be in school up to the age of 21. So they receive a student metro card, but some of them look older. So they get a lot of questions from transit authorities, police officers. Why do they have this metro card that looks like it's for a student, but meanwhile they look like grown adults?
Right.
And
Gaming the system.
right. And also sometimes they question, and I've been with them, and they say, what's wrong with him? Why does he have this? And right in front of them, you have to try to navigate around an inappropriate situation. And so it's difficult for them because they don't look like they're handicapped, but yet they're entitled. And maybe entitled to sometimes sit in the front of the bus because they have a disability and need to be able to see and get information. But maybe a lot of times the front of the bus is elderly people or people with physical disabilities, but somebody with a cognitive disability might need to sit in the front or have a physical disability that's not so evident as well. But they get grief about wanting to sit in the front of the bus sometimes as well. So
right.
It's very challenging.
That's a really good example. Anyone else want to share a story? Thank you.
My daughter has autism. She's 6, And shortly prior to her being diagnosed, we were at her annual physical with the doctor, and I was trying to explain to the doctor, I'm sorry that she is, throwing herself on the floor and refusing to let you touch her, and I apologize. We strongly suggest that, or we strongly think that she has autism. We don't have a diagnosis yet. And at the end of the appointment, the doctor looked at me and said, I don't think she has autism. I think she needs discipline. Oh. And that was sort of my introduction into what the rest of her childhood at least was going to be like for me and for her. So.
I just said, oh dear God. I'm sorry you had to experience that, and yet sadly, so often is the case where it's just, you see it's these social misperceptions around what it means to be disabled, right? And let me just say also another parenthetical is that the universal sign of access doesn't really help our case here, because, what does it show? It shows a sign of a person in a wheelchair. From just, a cognitive language perspective, it tells us that disability equals an assistive device. And, our brains work with a lot of shorthand. And so we quickly, look around and say, well, no wheelchair, no disability. And it's a problem. And I think, we're going to change that too. All right, click right. What do we got here? So here's another word cloud. And what this really describes is kind of, what we're all feeling when these misperceptions, come for us. Isolation, we don't feel heard. Bless you. We feel silenced. And the big word here is stigma. This is stigma. Often people with disabilities, and probably really in transportation, feel like they're an inconvenience. I know IDP created a meme at one time where we just had an image of a woman in the back of her head as she was walking into a city. And it said, "Dear world, today I might inconvenience you." Happily. You can see I'm a little haughty about being disabled. Unapologetic. I thought this image was compelling because the real question that I want to ask is why? Why are we so afraid of disability? Why? Does anyone want to guess? Anyone have an answer?
Fear of the unknown.
Yeah, no, yeah.
That's good. Right. Certainly an evolutionary basis for that. It also turns out that there's kind of a historical pattern that we have to reckon. And it starts with the ideal. And remember, I'm positioning this alongside the question of why are we so afraid of disability? And why is normal exalted? This is a work of art by Francois Vincent, and it's circa 1791. And this work of art depicts the 5th century painter choosing the most beautiful women of Crotone to paint the ideal, to paint Helen. Kind of an interesting painting, some dude sitting there with these kind of frightened women, frightened, excited women. But here's what's really going on in this painting. He's saying, you over there, beautiful elbow, come over here. You over there with the blue eyes, come. You with the beautiful kneecaps. And what this 5th century painter did is he took the most beautiful parts, he fractured humans, brought them together into this composite whole, and created the ideal that we exalt and strangely now confuse as normal. Yes, you knew I would get to Barbie somehow. Millennia later, circa 1959, these are the patent drawings from 1961. I was kind of excited to find them. It's the spec of Barbie. I mean, Barbie, this grotesque, disfigured body whose legs don't articulate, her arms don't bend, her waist emaciated. But this is Barbie. Man, this thing that we call normal has really played with our minds as humans in our society. Our systems and our structures are built for normal, diverse bodies. And I would posit here to say that having diversity is more normal than our notion of normal. Anyone agree with that? Our history with disability has not been kind. And I'm going back to the question again of why are we so afraid of disability? There was a period of time when literally disabled people with mental illness, were burned at the stake. We've heard of the Salem witch trials. We had a period of time when there were profiteers of disability who put us on stages and exalted us as freaks for a fee. Exploitation. And this one's really hard because it happened in the state of California. Mm-hmm. Anyone here familiar with the ugly laws? Yeah. Hit the books around 1840s. And San Francisco, the idea was to clean up the streets from the unsightly, disfigured bodies, the beggars. The last ugly law was repealed in 1979. Our lifetime, I believe, everyone in this room. Incredible. But another form of that systemic and structural oppression that we feel as disabled people was through forced sterilization of people with mental illness and other disabilities in our mental institutions and other medical institutions across our country. And these are the states that actually participated in this. Disability actually arced into a really interesting phase with the Jerry Lewis telethons. And that's when charity was sort of the way that we could participate socially in a social acceptable way with disability. We didn't have to get too close. We could watch it through our television. We didn't have to touch disability because God knows we might catch it. But we could give money to it. And as non-disabled people, we could impact change. And, frankly, they did a lot of good, but they kept the otherness there. It's not quite where I'd like to see us. Fortunately, in the 90s, the ADA was passed. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was amazing for Black Americans in terms of allowing them to be whole humans in our society, Unfortunately, disabled people did not, scoot in with the 1964 Act. But in 1990, we got the ADA. And so now we are recognized as whole people, even in doctor's offices and at schools. We just have to have great advocates. And we do have a lot of work to do with the ADA as well. Has anyone ever heard the word inspiration porn? Okay, it's in your glossary too. But in the 90s and 2000s as well, especially with the advances in technology, which is really cool, but disability kind of took a different turn. Like, wow, that disabled person is inspiring. I mean, look at her. If she can do that, I need to get off the sofa and go do a 5K. That's cool. But still a little bit of justification. And this is where we are today. I like to call it the era of inclusion and equity. Kind of a commercialized platform. Many companies like to hire disabled people. There's all kinds of back-end kickbacks that they get from the government. It's really great, but there's also a lot of failures out there. And that's what I want to talk about here. And that brings me to Becky. Mattel, our beloved toy manufacturer, really wanted to get into the inclusion conversation. And so Mattel created Share a Smile, Becky. Now, before I say any more, I do want to point out something kind of obvious and subtle. Share a smile, Becky. Share a smile. An entire sentence before you get to her name. I mean, there's Ken, and then there's Barbie, and then there's Share a Smile, Becky. That sentence justifies Becky, because Becky, while she may not be able to do other things, like fit into Barbie's Jeep, she can absolutely share a smile. And that's great. Now, I do have to say, and this would have been funny, but I X'd it. I was going to have a little skit with Ken, Barbie, and Share a Smile, but I decided against it. So I'll just enact it for you here. Ken and Barbie want to go on a hike. And Barbie wants to invite her friend, Share a Smile. Why is that funny? But when they pull up, as you can see here, Share a Smile is about the same size as the Jeep. What was Mattel really thinking? Were they thinking? I mean, this is absolutely incredible. And what you don't see here is what I didn't bring, because I'm kind of obsessed with these dolls. And it's really, I promise, because it's research. But I swear it is. But in Barbie's dream house, it's about $200 for this dream house. I mean, it's gorgeous. She has an elevator. And Share a Smile doesn't fit in her elevator. The doors aren't wide enough. There isn't a door. But what's absolutely stunning is that Share a Smile only fits in the kitchen, in Barbie's dream house. The kitchen. Okay, I mean, look, the kitchen's part of the home. I can get behind that. But look, let's be real. Share a Smile was sort of an afterthought. And when little girls and boys from across this country contacted Mattel and said, Mattel said, and rather than the designers and engineers at Mattel redesigning Becky's house, Becky's car, creating a wheelchair, I mean, your travel trainers, what might they do? Maybe a ramp? Anything else? Any ideas? What can we do to make this work?
Yeah, absolutely. They can put her with a nice custom van with the ramp.
Custom van with a ramp. I like that. Why not?
Lowered, custom paint. You know, Ken would be cool still. Everybody would travel.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, I'm tracking that. I get that.
Or like put the wheelchair fold up.
I mean, let's just imagine this for a moment. And I also want to point out the great scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson writes about this in her feminist theory, that Share a Smile is the actual only Barbie who has articulating limbs, which more closely approximates a human than this disfigured thing here called Barbie. Whose legs, I mean, they don't bend. Okay. All right. Right? There you go. So like I said, rather than the designers designing to really, really achieve inclusion, right? Because the definition of inclusion that I like to use is to not exclude in the first place. We won't need inclusion and equity programs if we don't exclude in the first place. And that means that our buildings and our systems and our structures meet the needs of diversity, diverse bodies, diverse minds. But Mattel didn't see it that way. Mattel discontinued Share a Smile. I mean, if that is not the most allegorical story, they discontinued her. They erased her. Yep. Okay. I'm going to right click here. And that's what I have to say about that. No, no, no. Coming to the last 5 minutes of my talk here. And this portion, I'm going to read. I got so fed up with some of these stories, these Mattel stories, Zappos, who creates an adaptive clothing line and forgets to ask disabled people what they need. Those kinds of stories. So I wrote a little declaration, a soft manifesto. It goes like this. Let me get to it. We, disabled people, do not want to live in the shadows. We, disabled people, refuse shame directed at us as a result of our bodily diversity. That was my accessible clock. We, disabled people, will not be silenced by idealistic policies, bureaucracies, and laws that simply cannot and do not apply to all people. We, disabled people, want an accessible built environment to have access to and navigate spaces like workplaces, schools, doctors' offices, public transportation systems, and more, where our bodies are today mostly unwelcome. We, disabled people, want clothes made for our unique shapes and sizes. We, disabled people, want media, news, television, film, and more to accurately represent the disabled experiences. Media that is directly informed by us, media that makes us visible, media that hires actual disabled actors. We, disabled people, want relationships that are about interdependence with non-disabled and disabled people, relationships that bend. We, disabled people, resist the notion that disability is some exception to some normalized body. We reject otherness. We reject narratives of less than human or better off discontinued than disabled. Sympathy, charity, and overcoming our disabilities to the delight and relief of non-disabled people. We, disabled people, insist on agency. We insist upon being fully realized human beings represented in the glory of our diversity. Thank you. So, many of you might wonder if I ever went back to my job. And the answer is no. Because when I get messages from people who tell me that the storytelling platform at IDP helped them connect better with their family, or that the teachers that I work with and talk to help them interact with their students better, I know that there's a place for me here in this work and that IDP is valuable. And so this is my life's work. And I want to thank you so much for hearing me out, for listening, for hanging out with Share a Smile. I hope you guys have an incredible conference, and I want to thank you for the important work that you do every day for our community. And that's all. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you so much. Another round of applause, please. We are a few minutes into our lunch. If anybody has any, don't apologize. Does anybody have any questions? Do you have a moment or two? I don't want to eat into lunch too much because we all know priorities around here. But does anybody have any questions?
I hope I phrase this right, because it's kind of like still like trying to get it together. But a lot of times I've been accused. I work on transportation for autistic adults and related developmental disabilities. And just doing the work, people will say, I work in a university setting as well, and they'll accuse me, oh, that's advocacy. Oh, you're advocating again, because I feel that individuals with disabilities have a right to travel independently as best they can and as best they want to. And then I realize, I look at my peers and I'm like, well, they're doing work on bridges, they're doing work on goods. Why is it not advocacy then for having the best bridge being built, or getting these chickens from Des Moines to California? Why is that not advocacy then? Because those are just the same thing. Try to move goods or people from this place to this place. And just because they have a disability, this one group that has not been thought in our transportation system and our transportation engineering, and they're left out, and we're saying, no, now we have to include them in and get them where they want to go, because they have a right to get where they need to go or want to go, just like everybody else. That's not advocacy to me once I put it in with these other, with bridges or other goods that we're moving and nobody questions. Well, they're advocating for their chickens to get across the country. No, people need them and they have the right to get them. And it's just part of the system.
This is a blog. I mean, you
But-
should blog this. This is an incredible story.
But I realized that, I'm like, it's not really advocacy.
Yeah.
If you look at it with all the other goods and people that we move.
That's an excellent point. And,
You know, it's that stigma, right? I mean, this underscores what stigma is. As soon as we call it advocacy, it becomes, it's part of this other corner of our thinking, and there's dismissals and all kinds of biases that are around it. And as you're aptly pointing out, there's advocacy going on in every industry at every corner.
And they don't label it.
And they don't label it that, and maybe we should. Maybe we should. Words are powerful. Thank you for sharing that. It's an excellent point. I really think you should write about that. Anyone else?
We're gonna do these 2 questions, then we're gonna head to lunch, okay?
I've got a mic here.
Thank you. Well, I got introduced to the whole transportation accessibility thing way back. I was a young lawyer right out of law school. I was an Army Reserve officer waiting to be made active. And so I was working over at the Congress, as Legislative Council. I was working on the DC subway bill. And people with disabilities were coming in talking about accessibility. And it just seemed to me, you mentioned the Civil Rights Act. It just seemed to me it was like the Civil Rights Act. They paid taxes like everybody else. And so they had the right to use this multi-billion-dollar project that all their tax money, my tax money, everybody else's tax money was going into. And that was just all there was to it. And it had to be built accessible, because if it wasn't built accessible, it never would be. Because once it's built, it'd be too much money to break it down and remake it. So it had to be built accessible. And fortunately, a name that a lot of people wouldn't even recognize, Senator Ralph Yarborough from Texas was one of the people who thought this was a great idea. And he worked with a lot of us young kids then who thought it was good. And in the report that came out when the 2 houses of Congress got together, it's in there. It says it's got to be built to be accessible to the handicapped. Those are the language of that day. And these days just say, well, blah, blah, blah. But it's built to be accessible to the handicapped. And that's in the report. And that's the idea that we should take with us. That, hey, look, these people pay taxes like everybody else, might have a disability, so what? It's the same thing as civil rights. They got to let them in and use what their tax money built. Flat ends, that's it.
Yes. And isn't that the definition of equity right there?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess this is going more towards your agency and what you've seen. I'm curious because I've had some similar to what was being said before. I've heard some comments about things like the bus drivers feeling like too many people have the discount passes, and well, I guess some people, and they feel like it's not real and that they're scheming the system. And I'm wondering if there's anything, because I work for one of the transit agencies, that we can kind of show, because it's like you can tell them as much as possible. And these stories, like the This Is Me stories, I think are great, but I'm not sure how many of those we can really get across in a training session. Like, if I can bring something back, I'd love some resources if you have anything to say, here is what we're talking about, and here's like a broad scope of it, just to kind of help get people on the same page, but in a, condensed session, because unfortunately that's reality.
It is a reality. And very quickly, there's a very low-tech way to handle this problem. And I love analog low-tech ways. And it has to do with the definition of invisible disability. If we are going to use that word, we have to accept the implicit meaning of it, which means that every single person in this room could potentially have an invisible disability, because by definition, it's unseen. And so there are other ways to assess, but these biases, these assumptions that we see in these different systems are really toxic. And I'm wondering how many studies have found, what is the ratio of legally accessed transportation, passes versus the schemers.
is it our imagination? I mean, really, I'd like to know those numbers, and then I think, we can tackle that. But the low-tech answer is an invisible disability means that you have to accept that and that it's unseen. And so even though that person doesn't look like they should be carrying that path, they have a right to. We have to trust people more.
Thank you again so much. One super quick announcement, and then we'll let you guys get off to lunch.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Christy McLaughlin. I'm on the board. I'm the chair of the Professional Development Committee. The Professional Development Committee is meeting during lunch today at Tony's Mexican Restaurant, which is about a 10-minute walk. We're going to meet at the front lobby. I'd say I'm going to give you a couple minutes to go to the restroom and put stuff in your room if you want to. But I'd say in about 5 minutes because we do have to rush and get there and get back. But if anybody is here that has not been a part of that committee and wants to, please do join us. We're going to have another opportunity during the Ideas Cafe to just share ideas on learning opportunities. But if you specifically want to be involved in the committee, then this is the opportunity to do that. So please join us, front lobby, in about 5 minutes if you'd like to go there.
Is there anything, a 10-minute walk will be 15 each way, that's a half hour.
Well, I can look for closer places in the 5 minutes that we have.
Still great. So the last